Hello, my brilliant British literature students. This is Miss Carlson. I just wanted to record myself reading a chapter is about probably all I'll get through during this recording, but something that I wanted us to do a close reading of um, for a lot of reasons, but I guess the main reason being I wanted to get you prepared for some questions that might be posed to you on the Unit 3 final for Charles Dickens' Hard Times. Today I'm going to be reading from Book 2 of that novel, and I am on Chapter 10. The title of that is Mrs. Sparsit's Staircase. So I'm just going to read, and I'll probably be doing kind of a think aloud as well, just kind of showing you how I go through my close reading and so kind of a read aloud, think aloud, so that you can kind of get a peek into where my mind goes when I read. Okay, here we go. Chapter 10, Mrs. Sparsit's Staircase. Again, this is in section 2 of the novel. Mrs. Sparsit's nerves being slow to recover their tone, the worthy woman made a stay of some weeks in duration at Mr. Bounderby's retreat, where, notwithstanding her anchorite turn of mind based upon her becoming consciousness of her altered station, she resigned herself with noble fortitude to lodging, as one may say, in clover, and feeding on the fat of the land. During the whole term of this recess from the guardianship of the bank, Mrs. Sparsit was a pattern of consistency, continuing to take such pity on Mr. Bounderby to his face, as is rarely taken on man, and to call his portrait a noodle to its face, with the greatest acrimony and contempt. Now, there's a lot going on in that paragraph, and some of it I understand and some of it I don't. What is this notion of her calling his portrait a noodle to its face? Why is it's in bold? So if I had the hard copy of this book in my hands, which I do, I would make, maybe put in the margin um, on a book that I own myself, a question mark next to this. I might circle the word noodle. Um, so I'm wondering, what's going on here? What's being said here? I'm going to go on for now and possibly go back to that later on. Mr. Bounderby having got it into his explosive composition that Mrs. Sparsit was a highly superior woman, to perceive that he had that general cross upon him in his deserts, for he had not yet settled what it was, and further that Louisa would have objected to her as a frequent visitor, if it had comported with his greatness that she should object to anything he chose to do, resolved not to lose sight of Mrs. Sparsit easily. So when her nerves were strung up to the pitch of again consuming sweetbreads in solitude, he said to her at the dinner table on the day before her departure, "I tell you what, ma'am, you shall come down here of a Saturday while the fine weather lasts, and stay till Monday." To which Mrs. Sparsit returned in effect, though not of the Mohammedan persuasion, "To hear is to obey." So I'm looking at this word Mohammedan. Hopefully I'm saying that correctly. And I'm thinking that is a reference to Muhammad. So I would have to, that's not the spelling I'm used to. I would think Muhammad would be M-O-H, not M-A-H. But again, something I might want to look at further at some point. I'm going to continue reading, but it's an interesting reference, allusion, I guess. And I'm wondering what the reasoning is behind it. Why is Charles Dickens using this word Mohammedan persuasion? Also, to hear is to obey does not sound like something Mrs. Sparsit would take to naturally. So I kind of want to come back and look at that part as well. I know this whole sweetbreads thing must mean something because this has come up before in the novel. Sweetbreads are organs, internal organs. You can have it from, I think Typically it's veal, a young cow, but I know it's different organs that are called sweetbreads. Organ meat, and it's very rich, and it's usually served in kind of a gravy. But why does the author continue talking about the fact that Mrs. Sparsit eats those? Anyway, just again showing you my brain as I read through this. And oh, also the part where it says Louisa would have objected to her as a frequent visitor. I was wondering what that was about too. Now, Mrs. Sparsit was not a poetical woman, but she took an idea in the nature of an allegorical fancy into her head. Much watching of Louisa, and much consequent observation of her impenetrable demeanour, which keenly whetted and sharpened Mrs. Sparsit's edge, must have given her, as it were, a lift in the way of inspiration. She erected in her mind a mighty staircase, with a dark pit of shame and ruin at the bottom, and down those stairs, from day to day and hour to hour, she saw Louisa coming. So I want to put myself in the shoes of Mrs. Sparsit, and I want to imagine in my head or in my imagination, I want to think about what that looks like. This giant staircase, and staircase is capitalized, making it important. So I want to think about this huge staircase. Like, what would it look like? Would it be made of mahogany wood? Does it have marble, risers on it? What does it look like? Where did she maybe come up with this allegory? Is it something biblical? I'm not sure. If you're not sure what an allegory is, that might be something you'd want to look up the definition for as well. But she's got this story playing in her head, and I want to say she's almost becoming obsessed with this allegory or this imaginative staircase. So much watching of Louisa and consequent observation to her impenetrable demeanor means she must be kind of spying on Louisa. So I want to be kind of looking for that in the coming paragraphs. I also think it's interesting where it says it's whetted and sharpened Mrs. Sparsit's edge, and it's giving her a lift, like an inspiration. It's kind of, I don't know if you've ever heard of, like, I think it's pronounced Schadenfreude or something like that, where you take pleasure in other people's demise. Schadenfreude, I think it's pronounced. It's a German word. Anyway, I'm kind of wondering if that's happening here. So I'm going to continue on here with this idea, and it'll tell us a little bit more about this imaginary staircase. It became the business of Miss Sparsit's life to look up at her staircase and to watch Louisa coming down, sometimes slowly, sometimes quickly, sometimes several steps at one bout, sometimes stopping, never turning back. If she had once turned back, it might have been the death of Mrs. Sparsit in spleen and grief. Now, I find it interesting that they use the word spleen here, considering that is an internal organ. And, this whole idea of Mrs. Sparsit eating internal organs, sweetbreads. I don't know. Connection? Question mark. She had been descending steadily, this is Louisa, to the day and on the day when Mr. Bounderby issued the weekly invitation recorded above. This idea of Mrs. Sparsit going to some kind of vacation home. Mrs. Sparsit was in good spirits and inclined to be conversational. "And pray, sir," said she, "if I may venture to ask a question appertaining to any subject on which you show reserve, which is indeed hardy in me, for I well know you have a reason for everything you do, have you received intelligence respecting the robbery?" So here we have Mrs. Sparsit certainly, pouring on the admiration and compliments to Mr. Bounderby. Why, ma'am, no, not yet. Under the circumstances, I didn't expect it yet. Rome wasn't built in a day, ma'am. Very true, sir, said Mrs. Sparsit, shaking her head. Nor yet in a week, ma'am. No, indeed, sir, returned Mrs. Sparsit, with a gentle melancholy upon her. In a similar manner, ma'am, said Bounderby, I can wait, you know. If Romulus and Remus could wait, Josiah Bounderby can wait. They were better off in their youth than I was, however. They had a she-wolf for a nurse. I had only a she-wolf for a grandmother. She didn't give any milk, ma'am. She gave bruises. She was a regular Alderney at that. All right, here we have some allusions. One I'm somewhat familiar with, one I'm not familiar with, and I'm probably going to look that up at some point. So I'm making notes again for myself. If I'm reading a PDF copy like this, I'm making notes in another note-taking program, whether that's OneNote or Google Docs or something. I'm making note of this, or just in a notebook next to me. In my actual book, I can write in the margins here, and I'm circling or underlining Romulus and Remus, and then I'm circling Alderney because I'm not exactly sure what that means. So I want to go back and look at that. Romulus and Remus, I know, is a really old story, and I think they made even some Disney movies, maybe cartoon type movies about it. One thing I think I recall from it is I want to say it is, if I'm thinking of the right thing, I don't think it's bred much anymore, and I don't think the Disney movies, the cartoons, are very easy to get your hands on because if I remember correctly, it's pretty racist, if I'm thinking of the right thing. So anyway, that's another thing I want to make a note about to go back and look at. Why this allusion to Romulus and Remus? Sounds like they were raised by wolves, right? They had a she-wolf for a nurse. All right. Ah, Mrs. Sparsit sighed and shuddered. No, ma'am, continued Bounderby, I have not heard anything more about it. It's in hand, though, and young Tom, who rather sticks to business at present, something new for him, he hadn't quite the schooling I had, is helping. My injunction is keep it quiet and let it seem to blow over. Do what you like under the rose, but don't give a sign of what you're about, or 100 of 'em will combine together and get this fellow who has bolted out of reach for good. Keep it quiet, and the thieves will grow in confidence little by little, and we shall have 'em. Very sagacious indeed, sir, said Mrs. Sparsit. Very interesting. The old woman you mentioned, sir. So, sagacious meaning, sage advice, right? So here she is kind of, throwing out those I don't know if they're really compliments, but kind of trying to blow up his ego, right? Like she's always throwing these things at him. Oh, you're such a sage, Mr. Bounderby. The old woman I mentioned, ma'am, said Bounderby, cutting the matter short, as it was nothing to boast about, is not laid hold of, but she may take her oath she will be, if that is any satisfaction to her villainous old mind. In the meantime, ma'am, I am of opinion, if you ask me my opinion, that the less she is talked about, the better. The same evening, Mrs. Sparsit, in her chamber window, resting from her packing operations, looked towards her great staircase, this is that imaginary one, and saw Louisa still descending. So here's where I'm starting to think again, she's kind of obsessed with this whole idea. She sat by Mr. Harthouse, this must be Louisa, sat by Mr. Harthouse in an alcove in the garden, talking very low. He stood leaning over her as they whispered together, and his face almost touched her hair, which would have been a lot in Victorian times, right? For them, especially her being a married woman, for her to be this close to this bachelor. If not quite, said Mrs. Sparsit, straining her hawk's eyes to the utmost. Mrs. Sparsit was too distant to hear a word of their discourse, or even to know that they were speaking softly, otherwise than from the expression of their figures. But what they said was this. You recollect the man, Mr. Harthouse? Oh, perfectly. His face and his manner and what he said? Perfectly. And an infinitely dreary person he appeared to me to be, lengthy and prosy in the extreme. It was knowing to hold forth in the humble virtues school of eloquence, but I assure you, I thought at the time, my good fellow, you are overdoing this. It has been very difficult to me to think ill of that man. My dear Louisa, as Tom says, which he never did say, you know no good of the fellow? No, certainly. Nor of any other such person? How can I, she returned, with more of her first manner on her than he had lately seen, when I know nothing of them, men or women? My dear Louisa, then consent to receive the submissive representation of your devoted friend, who knows something of several varieties of his excellent fellow creatures, for excellent they are, I am quite ready to believe, in spite of such little foibles as always helping themselves to what they can get a hold of. Sorry about this dog barking in the background. He hears somebody outside. This fellow talks. Well, every fellow talks. He professes morality. Well, all sorts of humbugs profess morality. From the House of Commons to the House of Correction, there is a general profession of morality. Except among our people, it really is that exception which makes our people quite reviving. You saw and heard the case. Here was one of the fluffy classes pulled up extremely short by my esteemed friend, Mr. Bounderby, who, as we know, is not possessed of that delicacy which would soften so tight a hand. The member of the fluffy classes was injured, exasperated, left the house grumbling, met somebody who proposed to him to go in for some share in this bank business, went in, put something in his pocket which had nothing in it before, and relieved his mind extremely. Really he would have been an uncommon instead of a common fellow if he had not availed himself of such an opportunity, or he may have originated it altogether if he had the cleverness. I almost feel as though it must be bad in me, returned Louisa, after sitting thoughtful a while, to be so ready to agree with you, and to be so lightened in my heart by what you say. I only say what is reasonable, nothing worse. I have talked it over with my friend Tom more than once. Of course, I remain on terms of perfect confidence with Tom, and he is quite of my opinion, and I am quite of his. Will you walk? They strolled away among the lanes, beginning to be indistinct in the twilight, she leaning on his arm, and she little thought how she was going down, down, down Mrs. Sparsit's staircase. Night and day Mrs. Sparsit kept it standing. When Louisa had arrived at the bottom and disappeared in the gulf, it might fall in upon her if it would. But until then, there it was to be, a building, before Mrs. Sparsit's eyes. And there Louisa always was upon it, and always gliding down, down, down. Mrs. Sparsit saw James Harthouse come and go. She heard of him here and there. She saw the changes of the face he had studied. That would be Louisa's. She, too, remarked to a nicety how and when it clouded, how and when it cleared. She kept her black eyes wide open, with no touch of pity, with no touch of compunction, all absorbed in the interest of seeing her ever drawing, with no hand to stay her, like no railing, right? Nearer and nearer to the bottom of this new giant's staircase. It's interesting that it's written as a giant's staircase, not a giant staircase, a giant's ownership, possessive, apostrophe s, staircase. That is something I want to consider and maybe take a closer look at again. With all her deference for Mr. Bounderby, as contradistinguished from his portrait, Mrs. Sparsit had not the smallest intention of interrupting the descent. Eager to see it accomplished, and yet patient She waited for the last fall, as for the ripeness and fullness of the harvest of her hopes. Wow, she's hoping. She's eager for the last fall, for Louisa's demise, if you will. Hushed in expectancy, she kept her wary gaze upon the stairs, and seldom so much as darkly shook her right mitten, mitten being like a gloved hand, with her fist in it at the figure coming down. I'm making a fist as I read that part. I'm thinking and imagining being Mrs. Sparsit shaking her fist at this Louisa doing this such a dishonorable thing, right? I mean, how judgmental of Mrs. Sparsit, as if she, forgive me, maybe this is not the most appropriate thing to say, but as if she has any, as if she's ever been tempted to, do something like this, to have an illicit affair. I mean, I don't think by the way she physically looks, she's got men beating down her door to have affairs with her. And, looks aside, she's just not a very likable creature, right? So I always think it's interesting that people who are not in a position to be tempted to do, to do any wrongdoing are the ones who seem to be most judgmental about those who are tempted. I don't know if that makes any sense, but in this case, Louisa in a loveless marriage, having this handsome, young, complimentary man come into her life, that's a big temptation, right? Has Mrs. Sparsit ever had such a temptation? My guess would be no, she is not. So I've come to the end of reading. Now what I would do is go back to the beginning. If I'm doing a close reading of this chapter, I would go back to the beginning and I would look through my notes and I would start to look into some of these things that I had put question marks by, that I had circled, because by now your brain kind of forgets. That's why taking notes is important. So she's being sent to this vacation home, it sounds like, or like a weekend retreat, some place that Mr. Bounderby must own. Why is he sending her there? Was kind of one of my questions in the first paragraph. Why is she being given this recess from guardianship of the bank? Is it due to the robbery that's happened? Is it due to Louisa doesn't want her around so much? Like what's going on here? What's this whole deal with Mr. Bonner being her calling him a noodle? I don't know. That's kind of an interesting thing too. So I'd probably start with that. I definitely wanted to look up the Romulus and Remus allusions. In fact, I think I'm going to do that right now. Oh, boy, I may have been way off with this, unless they did this in a Disney version as well. But okay, now I see it's Roman mythology. So I may have been way off with that, which, that's good. That's good that I'm looking it up then. In Roman mythology, Romulus and Remus, Latin, are twin brothers whose story tells the events that led to the founding of the city of Rome. Interesting, too, because Dickens often refers to Mrs. Sparsit as having this Roman nose. I think she's from some kind of Roman aristocracy. So interesting that this Romulus and Remus is coming up. The killing of Remus by his twin, along with other tales from their story, have inspired artists throughout the ages. Since ancient times, the image of a she-wolf suckling the twins has been a symbol of the city of Rome and the ancient Romans. Although the tale takes place before the founding of Rome, around 750 BC, the earliest known written account of the myth is from the late 3rd century BC. Possible historical basis for the story, as well as whether the twins myth was an original part of Roman myth or a later development, is a subject of ongoing debate. So I might want to look into something or do a little bit of research to find out what Dickens means by this Romulus and Remus reference. That's got me really curious. Now, where was that in here? Here it is. In a similar manner, ma'am, said Bounderby, I can wait, you know. If Romulus and Remus could wait, Josiah Bounderby can wait. So there must be something in the Roman mythology about waiting. They were better off in their youth than I was. They had a she-wolf for a nurse, so they nursed from this wolf. And I had only a she-wolf for a grandmother. Let's look up what this Alderney is as well. I like to use vocabulary.com. That's what we use in class. Alderney. Is it EY? Aldern? Alderney. Alderney. Attorney keeps coming up, so I might not be able to use vocabulary.com. I'm just going to do a general Google search here. Oh, okay. See, I'm learning something here. I did not know what this was. It's an island, northernmost of the inhabited Channel Islands. It is part of the bailiwick of Guernsey, a British Crown dependency. 3 square miles, making it the 3rd largest of the Channel Islands. What's this reference, though? I don't understand how it has anything to do with... I'm going to see if it'll say Alderney reference in Dickens' Hard Times. See if anybody else has already done the work for us. Okay, this might be something. A community reading project discovering Dickens. The illustration of Alderney cattle appeared in the Illustrated London News on December 9th, 1848. That is secretly a translation of the phrase sub rosa. This phrase refers to the staircase in the Doge's Palace in Venice. At the top of the steps are found the giants. Interesting. Statues of Mars and Neptune. Interesting considering at the end of that chapter was the giant's staircase. This is getting more and more mysterious as I go along here. Now, it says this illustration of Alderney cattle appeared in a catalog in 1848. And this book, Hard Times, was written in 1854. So it would be a relatively maybe well-known reference at the time. Now, when I look down here further, this Project Gutenberg one, it says, Girl number 20, possessed of no facts, is in reference to one of the commonest of animals. She was a regular Alderney at that. It's not giving me much. I don't know. I'm not finding much, so I might have to look into that later and get back to everybody when I can find. Here it does say again, though, Alderney, small fawn-colored dairy cow under the rose. All All right, so I'm going to look into that a little bit further and see if I can research and find anything for everyone. Because that, I don't know, that has me really interested. I'm going to go back. She was a regular Alderney at that. She was a regular cow? She was a regular cow at that, at giving bruises. She was a regular cow at giving bruises. So she didn't give milk. She gave bruises. I don't know. Very weird. Weird as in like strange. All right. What else did I want to? Oh, I wanted to look further also at this idea of why at the end here, the staircase is referred to in a possessive form, nearer and nearer to the bottom of this new. And why is it new? Giant's staircase, not a giant staircase anymore. It's a giant's, like owned by a giant. Is she the giant? I'm kind of curious also about this long paragraph of dialogue between Harthouse and Louisa. I might have to look at that a little bit closer as well. At the beginning of this chapter, was it referred to as a giant staircase, or am I making that up in my mind? She resigned herself. Da, 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 da. Oh, I also was going to look up this Mohammedan persuasion. I want to go back and do that too. And this whole idea of consuming sweetbreads. Okay, here's where they start talking about the staircase. She erected in her mind a mighty staircase, which I guess could also be called, a giant staircase, right? The dark pit of shame and ruin at the bottom. No, I just think it's interesting at the end now. It's a giant's owned by a giant staircase. And is she the giant? Maybe that will become clearer in the next chapter. All right, I'm going to sign off for now with a to be continued statement here, and I will see you again soon. Thanks for being here.